I am Camille Burge Hicks. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Villanova University, and I'm also currently serving as chair of the department.
That's very exciting. Is that new from the last time we spoke?
Not new, so it started in January, so maybe we just didn't
Oh,
cover it.
yeah, maybe we just didn't get of your
In the
list of
realm of all
accolades.
the things that are going on in my life, we probably just didn't get to it. So
That's
yeah,
amazing.
that started in January. It's a 3-year appointment.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And so talk a bit about your kind of specific area of research and expertise, because you have a one of these incredibly impressive resumes, but also a very specific set of things that you're interested in as an academic.
Thank you. So I study political psychology and race and ethnicity in American politics. And my research really has three key areas. The first deals with Black-white relations, like how do Black and white people get along? How do they navigate, racial dynamics, what that means for their public opinion and political engagement. The second is thinking about the role of emotions in politics. And this is probably the largest strand of my research, especially how we experience them as members of groups and what that means for our public opinion and political decision making. And right now, I focus a lot on emotional experiences of Black Americans and what
Mhm.
it means for their attitudes, what it means for their behavior. Most recently, I have a project looking at the emotions of women, diverse women, so Black women,
Hmm.
Latinas, Asian Americans, white women, and what this means, especially for their non electoral political behavior. The third strand of research, which also gets into that last part I was talking about, focuses on intersectionality. So I look at race and gender, race and class, more recently, colorism in politics, and also race and sexuality, thinking about especially the politics of Black gay men. And what comes first in terms of identities. So, like the racial group identity, or is it, being gay, or is it some combination? And what this means for political engagement. So, those are pretty much my three strands. And throughout those strands, I use mixed methods, both qualitative and quantitative methods. So, focus group studies, content analyses, and I'm a trained survey experimentalist. So, I analyze survey data, but I also create and program my own survey experiments using Qualtrics.
Amazing. So it's a very singular focused, not a lot of variation, not a lot of only really need like one skill set to do this.
One skill
Um,
set.
um, so so I would think I was actually introduced to your work by Ray Block, who we've had on the show a couple of weeks ago. I'm gonna have him back to talk about truth decay, which I said to my mother the other night, and she was like, "Tooth decay,"
Right.
and I was like, "No, a little different." But he introduced me to your work. I found this great panel that I think you and David Wilson and Ray and maybe one other person were on. And one of the things I hoped that you could take the audience through is something you talked about on that panel, which is kind of the origins of American political polling. And I think, in particular, the racial component of that, both thinking about the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, but also the exclusion of Black voters by George Gallup and others. And if you could just like root us in a little bit of history here about how polling has affected the Black community.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we're talking about polling and public opinion polls in particular, one of the things that I brought up in that conversation, and thanks to Ray, I love Ray, but one of the things that I brought up in that conversation is when we think about public opinion in American politics, more often than not, people of color are targets of opinion as opposed to agents with opinions. And so, what I mean by that is that if you were to go and search through like Gallup, Roper iPoll, any of the repositories, that have questions that date survey questions that date back to the 1930s, you'd be able to find an avalanche of data pertaining to how white people feel about any group, but especially Black Americans. So, like how they feel about things like interracial dating, bringing a Black person, or what they said in the data, not my words, but bringing a Negro home for dinner, how they feel about Negroes living in their neighborhoods, Negroes in politics, giving Negroes a right to vote. The list goes, on and on. And the thing that we lack, in the survey community is that kind of data for, people of color, generally speaking, but especially, for Black Americans. And there have been attempts in the past to measure both the attitudes and experiences of Black Americans. As you mentioned, Du Bois was one of the first folks that tried to do this along with Isabel Eaton. I think in the late 1890s, like 1896, 1897, the Philadelphia Negro was published in 1899. It was based on over 5,000 interviews, structured interviews that they created. And then Du Bois went on to conduct, some of the first series of studies of Black communities for actually the Department of Labor, which helped to really set a foundation for the field of survey research in ways in which I don't think he gets even enough credit for, within political science and the folks that do, survey research. So in those early years of polling, when Gallup and Roper were starting, their enterprises, 1936-ish, on up through the 1940s, particularly Gallup, they didn't usually have Black voices in these polls, in part because of the sampling strategy that was used. Most of the polling data at that time was actually based on voting records. And so like election participation as one of the most important criteria in like setting quotas for these polls. And so if we know American history, we know that, Black folks, specifically, in the South, but throughout the United States, depending on where you live, were not legally allowed to vote. So these surveys, while they did have Black Americans from different portions of the United States, those numbers were incredibly small. And so there's some political scientists, Eric Schickler, Adam Berensky, they've been working with Roper to add weights to the little survey data that they do have on Black Americans to try and see what they can pull together. But it wasn't really until like the 1960s that you start to get an understanding of Black public opinion. And even then, the sample sizes were really small. And so the responsibility really did fall on Black scholars to conduct this work. In 1979, I think it was Kenneth Clark, and Black political and business leaders like Percy Sutton, they started this group called Data Black Public Opinion Polls, with the thought of conducting polls of Black Americans quarterly, right? Like, we don't have this data, we don't have this information. It'd be great if we could do it, once a quarter. But it was short-lived, but it was still known as one of the first like polling projects that we have. And so 1979, right? Like, like this is, one of the first like clear understandings that we end up having of Black public opinion in like US history, which is insane when you think about that compared to like what we know about, how white people have felt about Black folks for years, or just compared to like what we know about how white people feel about different aspects of politics. And certainly you would think somebody has to be doing polling on Black people during the civil rights movement. Not really, right? And so it's this idea that, we have to consider, racial bias in terms of like sampling, that's and representativeness. That's been also part of the story of polling. That's not just a contemporary issue, but has a much longer, historical narrative, than just like today we're having issues sampling racial and ethnic minorities. It's like, no, we've had them. we've had them for, an incredibly long time. So again, scholars have been the ones at the forefront, like doing this work. So we have the National Survey of Black Americans, right, which started in 1979, was a longitudinal study that lasted until the early 1990s. You then get things like the National Black Election Study, the National Black Politics Study, that focus specifically on Black Americans, because even in the surveys that public opinion scholars use, like the ANES, the American National Election Study, which is our key source of public opinion data that public opinion behavior scholars use, usually have really small samples of racial and ethnic minorities, unless it's 2008 and you're oversampling Black people because Obama's running, right? And so, just telling the truth. So more recently, more scholars of color and those that are interested in the politics of racial and ethnic minorities in the last few presidential election cycles have come together to put together like the CMPS. And the abbreviation, I think it's the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Study. I'd have to go back and look at it. But the CMPS has huge samples of racial and ethnic minorities. And so what do I mean by huge? Like in a general ANES, you might have 3,000 respondents.
Mm-hmm.
And of those 3,000, you might have like 200 Black people, 200, racial ethnic subgroup folks. In the CMPS, they have like generally at least 2,000 people from each group, which is just amazing, right? When you're thinking
Wow.
about like Black Americans, Latinos, the diversity within the Asian American community, along with white Americans, because they're included in this survey as well. But like huge, sample size to be able to really make some in-depth comparisons and compare across things like, are you first generation, second generation, third is this your first language, just like English your first language. There's just all kinds of great things that they ask with huge samples of racial and ethnic minorities. But since we're talking about Black Americans especially.
Mm-hmm.
So still working, in the polling industry at large to try and find these larger samples of people of color, but especially of Black Americans. And it's not something that's like unique to this particular moment. It's a struggle that's been happening since polling, really started and got off the ground, in the early 1900s.
This is a super useful recitation
I'm
of
like,
100
sorry, that
years
was
of
a
polling.
long answer.
No, but it's perfect because I think it lays out the challenges. And I remember reading, I have a book called The Super Pollsters behind me, where he talked about Gallup having early on a kind of policy of it was like, uh, you know, 2-to-1 interviewing men over women because the assumption was women would vote the way their husbands and fathers did, and also tended not to vote in as high of numbers as men. For a variety of reasons. Same thing with Black people. We what's the point in surveying them if they're being prevented from voting in the first place? So like their vote's not going to get counted. Who cares what their opinions are? I guess is the
Truly,
idea.
truly.
And I think that this actually helps crystallize something that I was getting really irritated about yesterday, listening to a podcast with a political reporter, and they were kind of gaming out, okay, well, you've got to do something for this demographic and that demographic. And the kind of issue tie, the sort of ticking and tying, okay, here's, women care about healthcare and abortion, and Hispanic Americans care about immigration, and young people care about student loan forgiveness, and Black people care about crime and policing. And those things feel very like, in my parlance, I guess I would say that doesn't feel like targeting. That feels like stereotyping.
Hmm.
And that, like, maybe those things are true. Maybe those issues do over index for those groups. Maybe they don't. But when you look across sort of, what little you get out of crosstab data in national polling, to your point about very small sample sizes, also, I just want to say 3,000 respondents, 200 Black people. That's not a representative sample. Like, even it's just, it's small, but also it's not representative. But anyway, this makes me wonder about like how do we then start to understand, assuming that voters even have some sort of policy-based checklist of things that they're taking with them into the polling place and going, okay, well, the candidate ticks all my top 4 boxes. Are we even capable of understanding what the top 4 boxes would be by any given demographic group, or are we just sort of resorting to kind of lazy stereotypes about what we think the most important issues related to a particular demographic group are?
Oh man, this has been like one of my, I don't know the proper phrase to use because I don't want it to come back on me, but this has been like one of the things that I've been really concerned about for years. I mean, first is obviously dealing with like representativeness in different samples, and the issue that we have is that even when you're able to reach these people and whatever the subgroups are, most of them tend to be like high education, high income, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so you may get like a sample size that you find appealing, but most of the folks that are in that sample look the exact same. So they're not diverse, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you would end up with a lot of high and high income, perhaps Blacks or Latinos or Asian Americans. And to what extent is that representative
Mm-hmm.
of, the issues that people in those groups might prioritize? It's probably not. And so to get back to the question about like what could we do, to figure this out? Like, if are there certain four issues that people, are prioritizing, and how would we find out basically like what those things are? Is what I feel like the question is, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's that we would have to get really creative if we want to continue doing polling as a primary mechanism. We need to get really, or just more creative with our sampling strategy. One of the issues when you're doing polling with special samples, which racial and ethnic minorities are classified as, or if you were to focus like on all women, that would be also a special sample, or all insert whatever group. It's like, how do you reach them?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're doing things like census tracts and trying to figure out like, well, this neighborhood has, generally this amount of people. So if we're doing some kind of sampling strategy based on, spatial location, maybe it would be better to sample places where Black people or Latinos are known to live, right? And then even then, so it's like, so does that keep, your cross section small? Because then that might end up being another kind of demographic,
Mm-hmm.
that might have different indicators for both education and income. So I think the best way to approach this, is probably, it's more qualitative work, but nobody wants to do that because it takes a lot of time. Um, but you can imagine like going to Black churches, or,
Mm-hmm.
Catholic churches that focus on, that have like a mass in Spanish, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
or in Georgia, in the United Methodist Conference, there's a lot of like Korean churches that are there. Like, you could imagine if you were to like go physically to these areas and talk to people, organize focus groups and talk to people, or attend meetings where you might have like a critical mass of individuals from these groups, and then asking, leaders of these organizations. So thinking about, Kamala Harris and like the Divine Nine, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they have chapter meetings, for Black fraternities and sororities. It's not just an undergraduate thing like it seems to be for a lot of white fraternities and sororities. It's like a lifetime commitment. So like trying to get in touch with presidents of these chapters and asking them if they can come and talk to members of the group, or organize focus groups, with members of those groups. In some of my work, I've ended up emailing like lots of pastors and asking like, hey, I'd like to do focus group studies, with people in your church. Would that be possible? If you could help me organize it, of course, IRB approved. But asking them
Yes.
to, help me, get groups of people together to answer different questions that I'd like answered, for my research before I go and then do, survey experiments. And so I think we could get creative in that way, in terms of providing like more qualitative work and actually going to talk to people, as opposed to like just assuming that we think we know what their issues are.
Mm.
And then there's also, the point of, even if you didn't want to target certain issues like policing or immigration, there are consensus issues that you can appeal to that apply to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody cares about wages. Everybody cares about inflation. Everybody cares about healthcare. You know what I mean? Like, so,
Mm-hmm.
even if you wanted to appeal to consensus issues, like that's also something, that you could do. One of the things that I was going to say towards the top end of the comments, but I'll bring it back down here, is just that the issue that I have with a lot of the literature, in political science on racial and ethnic minorities, it reads as though like immigration is the only issue that Latinos care about,
Mm-hmm.
or affirmative action and welfare are the only issues that Black people care about, because we usually analyze them the most, when we're talking about like Black public opinion or the opinions of Latinos. Um, Issues related to immigration, issues related to, government funding of anything, or,
Mm-hmm.
affirmative action and hiring and promotion in other spaces. And so we don't really take the time to understand like how do other groups feel about this? Unless it's white people, right? We know how white people feel about immigration.
Yeah.
We know how white Americans feel about immigration. We know how white Americans feel about welfare and affirmative action. But even the questions that we have, in the survey data, like about welfare that we use for political science, I pulled it up just because I was like, I hope she asked me a question about this. I was like, I hope she asked me a question about this. But even the question that we tend to use to gauge like welfare attitudes in our survey in the ANES, it says some people feel that government in Washington should make every effort to improve the social and economic position of Blacks. Suppose these people are at one of the scale at point one. Others feel the government should not make any special effort to help Blacks because they should help themselves. Suppose people are at the other end at point seven. And of course, some people have opinions somewhere in between. And then it asks you to say like where you feel, like where are you, between 1 and 7. And so in my mind, I'm like, well, white people receive welfare too, right? But we don't know how people feel about like white recipients of government funding or other things, because like that's not how the question is worded. So there's like a few issues that are here that we need to talk about. The first is like representativeness in sampling strategies. I think the second, going back to the comments that I made are also about like how do we get to those people, right? So if the survey, the polls aren't going to be representative, are there other methods that we can use to get to those people? There are. We just don't necessarily want to use them because they may be, more expensive when we try to do this targeting. And then the third thing is like also thinking about the kinds of questions that we ask in surveys and who we ask them to and who we're analyzing like that data like among. All of these things, I think, contribute to conversations surrounding representativeness and public opinion in polling and public opinion research. And just all of that contributes to our general understanding of what's happening, within these groups with their attitudes as well.
I'm so glad that you went in this direction because you used a phrase that it just spoke to me. I mean, obviously, my primary practice is as a qualitative researcher, and so saying a phrase that I think was something like, "Well, if we want to keep doing polling as our way of doing this," and I was like, "Yes, maybe there's something else," but also, a standard of our practice. Whenever we do any kind of quantitative work, we do qualitative first because we need to make sure that whatever, if we're doing statement batteries or if we're trying to figure out what type of question type to use, is it a scaled response or a multi-select or a sorting exercise or a highlighting exercise? I mean, there's a million things we can do with survey instruments now. The question is always, are we speaking in the language of the people we want to survey, or are we speaking in the language of our client or what we usually do?
Yeah.
And we attempt to talk about these things in ways that sound like the people we interviewed instead of in ways that sound like, whatever we did last time. And this shows up in a couple of ways. And so like the analogy I would give is, I've had clients who do brand trackers and they have various brand attributes that they're measuring over time. How much do people associate these characteristics with a slate of brands?
Mm-hmm.
And what's always hilarious is then we go talk to people and we find out that those characteristics, some of them, are just completely irrelevant to anyone's priorities in the category. And others, it turns out, people, ordinary folks, are not using the same working definitions of those terms as the brand is using. Like they think energetic means something, but actually it means something else, right? And so like they have misunderstood what that characteristic represents to people. But this, immigration, I think, is a great one where you get these, I'm getting all kinds of surveys because I'm in finally a competitive congressional district, apparently. And so it's new for our congressional district, but the survey question where it asks about, immigration and the border. And I always just kind of freeze slightly looking at that topic, because what are we talking about? Are we talking about immigration judges and not having enough of them? Are we talking about asylum policies? Are we talking about seasonal migration? Are we talking about people who have family here? Are we talking about people who have not gained citizenship but have been married to a U.S. citizen, have U.S. citizen children? Like, which things are we talking about? Because immigration and the border is a basket of issues. It is
Right,
not a single issue.
right. Yeah, and I mean, this is the thing about survey construction and design. So I will say, there's a lot of pre-testing that goes into a number of questions in political science, especially the ones
Mm-hmm.
that we, use on our surveys that have been, validated for years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when you're talking about, these issues like immigration, there's so many aspects of it that people may have different opinions on. And so when I'm teaching public opinion and political behavior, I spend probably about at least 2 weeks talking about polling
Mm-hmm.
and dealing with things like survey construction and design, dealing with things like question wording and response options, and making sure that questions that we ask are balanced in terms of in terms of it being like both negative and positive, not just like
Mm-hmm.
all negative, really drawing on Herb Asher's book, Polling in the Public, being one of the tools that I use to teach my students about, you know, how to properly construct surveys and the importance of doing so. And I think you're 100% right. Like when we have these, broad topics like immigration, and somebody just sends you a text message like, how do you feel about immigration? And you're like, what? I mean, I have lots of thoughts, right? Like, and
Right.
going off of, like what you just mentioned, right? Are we talking about asylum seekers? Are we talk? I watch 90 Day Fiance. All of
Mm-hmm.
my K9 visa folks stand up. Like, are we talking about marrying into,
Mm-hmm.
relationships and how that works? Like, there's just so many different, aspects of immigration that we're just not able to gauge. And part of the issue with existing especially academic surveys is we only have so much space, right, to ask these
Mm-hmm.
questions. And so it's like I get maybe 1 to 3 shots to ask a question about immigration. So my 3 shots are going to be like, what do you think about the number of immigrants? Like, should it be increased, decreased, kept the same, which is like a standard question that we
Mm-hmm.
ask, but not really grappling with all of the details that might go into one's opinion about immigration as like a very large, all consuming topic. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I think we definitely need to do a better job of that as well. There's just all kinds of limitations. It's funding, right? Like,
Yep.
who has the money to ask a 15-20 minute survey, that's devoted specifically to issues on immigration? Not a lot of people, not a lot of academics, that I
Mm-hmm.
know. And so you try and get your questions in like where you can on these surveys that have, nationally representative samples, but it's not the exact questions that you want to put in there, but it's like I can just get a little idea about something. So I think that's, part of the issue, but certainly we could definitely do a better job if there were more funds available.
Mm-hmm.
If people engaged in more pre-testing of questions. So a lot of folks now in the survey world, will use programs like Mechanical Turk. I don't know if it's
Mm-hmm.
called Mechanical Turk in Turk anymore on Amazon, but
Mm-hmm.
really for the last decade to like test questions.
Hmm.
You might also use student samples to test questions to figure out like what you should actually be asking before you end up putting them on a survey. So I think there's lots of thoughtful testing that happens to get to the
Mm-hmm.
questions that we see, but it still doesn't answer your question about like there's so many different aspects of immigration that I have opinions about. So when you ask me that question, I'm not able to provide like a cogent response because I may feel X way about this aspect of immigration, but this particular way. And so the question is
Yeah.
not really capturing, what I know to be like my true thoughts and feelings on a given topic.
Yeah. I mean, it's so obviously I'm always going to be the person who looks at a survey and goes, interesting, but what do they mean?
Right,
um,
exactly.
why did
And
they
then
say
that's where,
that?
and so one of the things that I've done in my research with Cindy Cam, we did these stop and reflect measures. So
Mm-hmm.
even if you're doing survey research, you can get like a qualitative component to understand what people are thinking. So in our paper, we read a paper on racial resentment um, and how Blacks and white Americans respond to this measure, this racial resentment battery, which is
Mm-hmm.
supposed to measure um, more implicit racial attitudes. So it's a 4 question measure for anyone that's unfamiliar with it. One of the measures says like Irish Italians and Jewish people like work their way up without any special favors. Black people should do the same. or like generations of slavery make it difficult for Black people to get ahead. And so there's 4 questions that political scientists use. Sociologists tend to use 6 to 8, but we use about 4 in our battery. Um, some are reverse coded so that the people that are at the top of the scale are considered more racially resentful. The ones that are at the low end of the scale are not. And so we wanted to know, I was like, well, how do Black people feel about this? Because they've been asked this battery of questions since 1986 as well. Does it actually predict, their political attitudes as much as it predicts white people's attitudes? And does it
Mm-hmm.
look similar? Does it look different? Like what's going on, right? Because there can be Black folks that respond to this battery like in a racially resentful way as well,
Mm-hmm.
getting at tropes of like individualism and being hardworking.
Right.
And so one of the things that we did in the survey when we had it was after each of those questions, we asked respondents, like, so you just answered this to the previous question, like, the preload the answer. Can you please, explain to us what was going through your mind as you answered that question?
Mm-hmm.
So then we not only have, the actual survey, responses to the 4 questions that we care about, we have really rich qualitative data that didn't take long to collect at all, but took long to analyze.
Mm-hmm.
We have like, because you're talking about 4 responses, 4 open-ended responses per respondent.
Yeah.
It's a lot of data. So you're able to get that richness there with the quick stop and reflect, which
Mm-hmm.
is also a tool that I think, pollsters may be interested in using. So imagine if you were to receive that question about immigration and it says like, well, you just answered, I'm not really sure about how I feel about whatever aspect of immigration they asked you about. Can you explain why you selected that answer? And you would type, well, here are my thoughts about, these particular aspects of immigration. So now the researcher, once they receive your responses, they're like, this person's thinking about more than insert whatever when I'm
Mm-hmm.
asking about immigration and broadly construed. So maybe I should be considering these other things as well. Like that would be something, helpful
Yeah.
that we could do as well. Folks that are, doing surveys, and especially practitioners that use, pollsters in particular, instead of just these like one shot, very broad questions, maybe a little stop and reflect. And you can actually get some really good data from the inclusion of maybe one of those measures that you would otherwise, not have. So then you actually know, here are the things that people care about.
Yeah. I
I
love
think that's
this. I love this approach.
great.
And I think it's also related to, another kind of related question. I know we talked about the racial resentment score before, and I've also spoken with David Wilson about his work on racial resentment, and
Amazing.
hoping to get him on the show soon. But
Yeah.
um, some of these indices have been around for a long time
Sure.
and, are directionally useful, have been validated in whatever way that they've been validated. I
Mhm.
guess I have a undergrad question for you,
Yeah. I'm
which
sure it's
is
not undergrad, but let's go. Yeah. Yeah.
which is like, you know, cultures change, norms shift, and some of these measures, when I look at them, I feel like you can guess who wrote them
Yeah.
demographically, right? And it's like, okay, so 50 plus white guy in academia wrote that question in the 1970s. Is it still relevant? Is that still how people actually experience, whether it's
Mm,
racial resentment or anything else? I mean, obviously, like the immigration question is kind of a funny one for me. I am married to an immigrant. I mean, he's English, but he's an immigrant nevertheless. He's now a US citizen. So
mm,
I'm always going to hit that question differently because I've actually sat in immigration, offices having conversations about
mm,
visas and green cards and citizenship.
mhm,
I've had to prove that I really am married to this guy and that I really do know him, that we have met before. But that is so I'm going to have a different perspective on that anyway. But there are some of these questions, like that question about Italians and Jews, have
mhm,
like this. This is not. This feels anachronistic in some ways, and maybe for some groups of people in the population, it's less anachronistic. I would imagine, like, I don't know. Maybe it's because, look, I'm from Portland, Oregon. Everybody's white except who's not, and it's the West Coast also, where your whiteness is sort of like no longer ethnically identified.
Sure, yeah,
And
yeah.
so living in the Northeast, it's very different. It is ethnically identified. So maybe there is more resonance regionally than just sort of generationally or what have you. But I guess my question is this. Are we sure that these indices are as well theorized as we hoped? Do they need to be re-theorized? How often do we kind of update our understanding of these types of measures?
Yeah. So, I mean, going back to that paper that I wrote with Cindy, it's like the measures are still useful, right? But maybe what we call the measure is not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's not, we came up with a really long name for it that people were not into, but so maybe it's not racial resentment that it's capturing. Maybe what it's capturing is structural versus individual attributions of blame for like
Mm-hmm.
where Black people are in American society. And so the questions still useful, but
Mm-hmm.
what we call the battery is maybe not that useful. And so we said in our paper, in our Journal of Politics paper, we suggested that we recast the racial resentment battery as structural versus individual attributions for Black Americans' economic and social status. That's not a pretty name like racial resentments, but like this is what this scale is actually capturing. Are you saying that it's because basically people are, lazy and don't want to work hard? That's where they are. Failures of individualism in society, or are there government structures, right, and these other
Mm-hmm.
important forces, laws, that have helped to
Yeah.
subjugate a particular group of people. And so it's not that the battery isn't useful. It's like if we want to apply the battery to other people, and if we want to update the battery to help make it make sense in this particular era, that maybe we need to recast, maybe we need to rename what it's actually doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because that's what these questions are doing. They're placing the blame for social and economic disadvantage on the individualistic ethos, like whether or not
Mm-hmm.
somebody worked hard or did not, or whether or not there were other structural factors in place that, hindered them from that progress. And so I think that's one of the things that we can do, right? It's not that we have to get rid of all of these questions. Maybe we recast the questions,
Mm-hmm.
right? And maybe we do more of the qualitative work to like understand what's going into people's opinions when they're answering these, traditional scales or indices that we have in a contemporary era. One of the things that I found when I was doing focus group studies with Black Americans, this was in it would have been in 2012, 2013
Mm-hmm.
in the South. So this was like a while ago. I was talking to Black churchgoers about their emotions and how they connected to their politics.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, I asked them to, fill out a little survey questionnaire, just so I could also have some little survey data, like to gauge their demographic, factors. It was anonymous. I also had a couple questions on their like stereotype measure questions because in my mind, I guess I was going to do some kind of analysis on what the people were saying and how they thought about groups and stereotypes. It didn't pan out. All ideas that you have aren't good ones.
Yeah.
But, so when they were answering like the stereotype measures that we often use about scales related, like going 1 to 7,
Mm-hmm.
hardworking, lazy to hardworking, scales related to intelligence, related to violence. I had them using these scales, and this was, over a decade ago. And the first thing that someone that was filling out the survey said, like, these stereotype batteries are racist, like, and so I was like, yeah, after we were done with the focus group, I was like, yeah, it was just going back to this question, like, should we be asking these questions in this particular way? And that's a question that we ask. These are questions that we ask for like all groups. So it's not just like Black
Mm-hmm.
Americans, it's like whites, Latinos, Asians, insert whatever racial group. But it's something that I come back to, often, or this idea that what we know about welfare and or affirmative action and most of the survey data that we have is only limited to Blacks. There's nothing that asks about affirmative action for white women, right? Or that we could, which we should be asking because, they're beneficiaries of affirmative action as well. But we don't have any survey data that would recognize that because most of the data that we have that's about affirmative action or welfare, however the questions are constructed, the target group is usually Black Americans or Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that in those cases, you certainly need to update these questions and include more groups. Um, or in other cases, like with the racial resentment battery, maybe it's just a recasting and use of qualitative data to understand what's actually going in, to
Mm-hmm.
people's answers. So I'm definitely with you on this idea that a lot of these questions, were created a very long time ago, and thinking about the extent to which they still capture what's going on. And what I will say is, like, if they didn't, they wouldn't be on the surveys. There are different things that we have to ask about
Mm-hmm.
now that we just didn't before. So like there are questions about like non-binary individuals. Like even when you're asking like the gender identification question, for years there was no like non-binary response. For years there was no category for same-sex marriage, and thinking about like when people ask you questions about whether or not you're married, it's just
Mm-hmm.
like, yes, you're married, or like being cis het or not. Like those kinds of questions just didn't exist. That
Right.
doesn't mean that LGBTQ people also didn't exist. It just means that we weren't capturing their identities, and we were not able to measure, like how those different identities might shape their politics in ways in which folks that don't have those identities like might feel about politics. And
Mm-hmm.
so like those things are slowly changing, which are good signs. But I think that there's still a lot more work that, we need to do to recast or update scales, or, update questions so they're not so targeted
Mm-hmm.
towards certain groups. And become like more inclusive
Yeah.
in the polling industry. Just because a question's been asked for 50 years
Yeah.
doesn't mean that it can't change. Or if it's been cast a certain way since like 1986 for 37, 38 years, that doesn't mean that the interpretation of that battery like can't change, and we can start to incorporate that understanding into how we then discuss what was known as racial resentment. So, I mean, people will not be happy, but
Well,
there's still good social science to be done here. And I think a
right.
lot of it can come from, modifying existing measures, creating new ones that we have tested, that we know have relevance, that have been validated, um, and just doing the work. It's easy to kind of continue putting existing measures on surveys. It's hard to, produce your own and
Mm-hmm.
figure out what you should or could be measuring. So
So that to me is you talked about this with the project you were talking about, of like the emotional component of political opinion.
sure.
And because I think people people have emotional responses to the questions themselves. People respond to public polling emotionally. People interpret public polling emotionally.
Mhm.
um and there is, and yet I feel like most of the questions that you see on a national poll conducted by pick your favorite newspaper, or TV news division or whatever, the emotional questions tend to be things like, I don't know, enthusiasm about voting, approval or favorability, which
Mhm.
still feel like they're tilting more towards the rational than the emotional, in some respects.
Mhm.
And you do get to things that feel very, some of the kind of characteristics, like which candidate is strong, which candidate is whatever.
Mhm.
That strong feels like multi-coded, like
Sure.
there's gender there, and there's emotion there, and
Mhm.
there's other kind of cultural codes there. But maybe talk about, where are the emotional questions, where do we start to think about people's emotional affect in relationship to their political choices? Because it seems like there's a lot of emotion happening amongst voters and amongst the parties and everybody else. And so why don't we seem to ask more about that in public polling? I'm sure that we do in political science, but maybe talk a bit about the challenges there.
Yeah, I mean, look around you. Everything, people are in their feelings about a lot of different things. Like we can talk about a lot of different groups feeling angry, anxious, afraid, enthusiastic,
Mm-hmm.
like pride, hopeful, on both sides of the aisle. Um, you don't see a lot of that in polling,
Mm-hmm.
broadly construed, right? Like you said, thinking about enthusiasm for a candidate, like how enthusiastic are you about blah blah blah, right? And that's favorability ratings. That's basically about it. In political science, the work on emotions, at least like the survey research on emotions, really started to jump off in the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And so the survey question that's typically used to measure emotions in political science research is a question that's candidate centric. The question says, we'll just use Donald Trump as the example, has Donald Trump, because of something he's said or done, ever made you feel insert emotion? And so they have like, it would be like a Donald Trump, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, insert
Mm-hmm.
political candidate, political elite, Hillary Clinton, insert emotion. Um, Angry, afraid, anxious. I think they have ashamed, and I think they have pride.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so for years, this has been the question, these have been the questions that people use to then predict attitudes. So, like going back to immigration,
Mm-hmm.
um, predict people's attitudes about like immigration or predict people's attitudes about a wide range of policy opinions. And to a lesser extent, like their support for candidates, like so would you vote choice, vote intention, feeling thermometers, a wide range of dependent variables. Um, and so where my work really comes in with that is looking at psychology research that have been studying emotions forever. They've been doing this work for
Mm-hmm.
a very long time. And one of the things that psychology researchers talk a great deal about is that emotions have all kinds of attitude objects or stimuli that you're responding to. And so the way that the question is worded within political science research really focuses on the actions and words of candidates, right? Which is hugely important for elections.
Mm-hmm.
But those candidates aren't the only, or political elites aren't the only things that people are emotionally reacting to
Mm-hmm.
and that are having an effect on their vote choice. So, or a wide range of dependent variables that are related to politics beyond, vote choice, like protesting, donating money to candidates, signing
Mm-hmm.
petitions, talking to your friends about politics, attending local board meetings, things like that. It's not just what these candidates say. People have opinions about a lot of things. So thinking about banning books, thinking about reproductive rights, um, thinking about police killing unarmed individuals of color, right? These are a lot of different targets that can bring about a wide range of emotions, for people.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I do in my work is talk about like, what are some of those things? And also like, how do we experience emotions as members of groups, right? Because politics are group centric, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how you feel or think as like a partisan or as a woman or as a black person, maybe somebody that might be Latino or person of color or intersectional identities, all of those things like work together to inform your politics. And so we should be talking about these things as well. So while the polling data writ large like doesn't tend to deep dive into emotions, psychology scholars have been doing it for a very long time. Political scientists are coming to the table, of course, with these candidate centric questions. More recently, people doing work on the emotions of partisans with like under the topic of affective polarization, um, thinking about how Republicans and Democrats like feel as members of these like partisan groups and like what that then means for their politics,
Mm-hmm.
but not as much work dealing with like racial and ethnic minorities. Davin Phoenix and his work dealing with the anger gap focused on blacks and whites. There have been a few articles here and there that deal with, black people and their emotions. My work in
Mm-hmm.
particular, focusing on anger and pride that I have published and my forthcoming book that hopefully will be out early next year. Fired up, ready to go. Pride, Shame, and Anger in Black Politics. So there's that. There's a few works dealing with like Latinos and fear surrounding what?
Mm.
Immigration, like we just
Mm-hmm.
talked about. So it exists and it's growing. And I think that that strand of research in political psychology is only going to get bigger because literally we emotionally react to things every single day. And like
Mm-hmm.
when you plug in, group identities and different things in politics that are happening on a daily basis, you can combo that in any way to come up with an interesting research topic or a paper or even an entire book manuscript. And so I think it's a really promising, area of research within political science and within political psychology. And I would hope, that more pollsters would ask more questions about emotions, because I think that they're doing a great deal more work
Mm-hmm.
um, than we currently have the data to analyze.
Yeah.
Like how do white Americans really feel about America becoming a majority minority nation? That's a real consideration, for some of these individuals that are voting.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of like displacement. How do Black people feel about, police killing unarmed individuals of color, or um, pay equity issues? Just like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of different things that go into people's opinions are very much so based on group membership and emotions. And I don't know that we have as many questions in the polling industry as we could or should that really get at those things that are happening, and that can help us explain, the dynamics and how we see them play out in the election cycle, but just in in the everyday in the everyday world, like people going
Mm-hmm.
to school board meetings being packed now. Never. Like
Yes.
like never. And so like what
And
are the
packed by
things that
kids, by people who don't have kids in the school
right,
district.
people like, you don't even go here, like
Yeah.
your kid doesn't even go here. Like what are you doing there? Like what are you
Mm-hmm.
so fired up about? Right. And so like understanding that there's people on both sides of this discussion, like Moms for Liberty, that are very concerned about what their children are reading in schools, and other folks that are really concerned about books pertaining to their history, being banned, or their lived experiences being banned. And so it's like, oh, yeah, well, I'm upset about that, or I'm anxious about the fact that my kid won't have the opportunity to learn this if they're in this particular school system. Like, these are real concerns,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think that we're capturing them, as well as we could be capturing them with the polling data that we have access to. So that would be my hope. Like, please ask more
Yeah.
questions about groups and emotion.
Yeah, and it also feels though like there is a lot of research being done about this. It's just that national polling in election years gets covered.
That's right.
That's the political science research that
Right.
gets talked about publicly.
Right.
And then it does seem like we wind up to almost being in kind of, I think I said this in one of my emails too, but like almost voters who pay attention to this stuff anyway are sort of in dialogue with the polls themselves. Like they're finding out that other voters feel a certain kind of way about things and then having responses to that. Um, the like conversations that were had earlier in the year about or even into last year about like are presidential approval ratings and favorability ratings actually related to vote intention anymore, or are they becoming disentangled from one another? And so like does it matter if I tell a pollster that I don't love this candidate but I'm going to vote for him anyway?
Right.
um and then I think the other thing I think about is it's so interesting, the emotional work, because I mean, in all kinds of categories, I touch the kind of emotional affect of people thinking about, for example, going back to finally get a bachelor's degree as a working adult,
Mm,
after probably trying multiple times and not quite finishing, or not
mhm.
being able to do it when they wanted to do it, not being able to finish when they wanted to finish. Life intervenes and knocks you off course. The the emotional relationship to the decision to go back to school is different for them than for like a middle class kid about to graduate from high school whose parents went to college and have lots of support structures and all, and can afford it and all of that. And so the things that matter most to them in selecting a school, for example, are going to be different because one is coming to it with like more anxiety, frankly, than the other group. When some of those folks who are returning may feel more, it may not be as extreme as this, but something like shame because they have tried and failed previously. And so will they be setting themselves up to fail again? Versus, you know, the 18-year-old kid from Cherry Hill who's just going to go to Penn and he knows he's going to be fine. Like that, that kid doesn't have the same anxieties. So his school selection criteria is different. I've been thinking a lot about the shift over the last week of people going from Sarah Longwell uses this phrase that I love about like knife, you know, knife in the teeth kind of way of getting to the end of this election. And like going from that sort of a grim determination to vote for your preferred candidate to enthusiasm.
Sure.
Like being really excited for it. Does that change the issues that matter most to you? Like your emotional affect, does it reorder the things that you care about because you're almost kind of working backwards from, well, I really love this candidate. You know, people who really love Trump but don't have strong policy priors, like, do they reorder their policy priors because they love Trump? Do people will people who were supporting Biden shift around their policy priors based on their enthusiasm or not for Kamala? There's this is the thing I've been wondering about, and I don't know if you know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. I think that's a wonderful, research project to look into. I'd like to write on that. Right. What we know in the literature and the data. Evelyn Simeon has a book called Historic Firsts. And so in her work, she talks about how if there are like if a candidate is a historic first, so like the Barack Obama being like the archetypal example of this, right? That creates a certain level of pride, a certain level of enthusiasm, gins up this pride, enthusiasm, joyful reaction of people that might identify with that group, which leads to greater political engagement. That doesn't say anything about issue prioritization, though, right? That's just like different political participation that happens, not just the vote, but you might go and start canvassing, right? You might go and engage in all these other activities, donating money to different causes to help get a candidate elected, among other things that she finds. But that doesn't say anything about the question that you asked pertaining to issues. That I think it's a really interesting one. When I think about this in connection to like the recent race, some of the comments that I've been seeing on like social media is like, so people are just gonna support Kamala without knowing what her policy stances are, like that's a real question. Like that's a real question, that people have. You're just gonna let that like enthusiasm or whatever that positive emotion that you might have associated with this person like drown out any policy relevance that you might be interested in exploring. So I don't know that we have, I can't say I don't know that we have, I'm not aware of scholarship that might exist that would engage that question about like prioritizing different issues and it drowning out. I think what I would think would happen based on the existing literature would be something along the lines of like perhaps those positive or negative emotions can drown out whatever the policy stances might be, in support of like whatever that final electoral goal actually is. So that would be like my guess. And I think that you could probably pull from the affective polarization folks to make that argument, right? Because it's like perhaps at some point your party identification would drown out your disagreements, right? With the issues that somebody else might have, right? And so like this idea that after you get through the primaries and you're stuck with your general election candidate, right? Like you may not agree 100% with them on all of the issues that they have, but because they're a member of the party that you support, you're still going to support them, right? So there are people, on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, that, you know, will never support the other party for any reason,
Right. Yeah.
will never support the party for any reason. And so I think it's an interesting question to think about, like, is there a way that emotions could change that? Is there a way that
Hmm.
emotions could change the way that you're prioritizing issues, like how you feel? And I think that, I don't know, I feel like you could just definitely see that, like, on both sides right now, like
Yeah.
with people that might be more inclined to support, President Trump or former President Trump, um, thinking about, like, majority minority status, thinking about
Hmm.
immigration in particular, and this idea that, like, even if you don't support Donald Trump, like this idea that, like, the Democratic Party may not stand for any of that, or they might
Hmm.
not be thinking about any of that. And so, like, I'm really angry about these issues. I don't care who's atop the Republican ticket, I'm supporting the Republican candidate. Or if you're, a woman that is pro-choice, right? Like, you may feel really unsettled about the things that are happening throughout state legislatures surrounding reproductive rights. You don't care who's atop the
Hmm.
ticket, you're still voting for the Democratic Party. So I think that if this is the case, I would think that, like, partisanship might drown out these other things. We're talking about, like, partisanship and emotions, like,
Hmm.
because you understand that the opposite party is not at all going to champion whatever those issues are, and so
Yeah.
you're going to stick with whoever's at the top of your ticket, regardless. Like, you may not have the same opinions on, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right?
Hmm.
Or, like, whatever. But that may drown out, you know, for
Right.
whoever's at the top of the ticket. I don't know. So there's, like, I think there's a good project here to be done, thinking about issue prioritization and
Yeah.
emotions and the extent to which things can get, like, drowned out. That's a good project.
It seems.
I haven't, I'm like,
it,
I haven't seen it, so you want to
yeah.
write it, Sarah? Like,
Yeah. I
I
mean,
haven't seen it.
it's an interesting question, even in the some of the issues you mentioned, where like, um, yeah, there were a lot of people who did not say that uh, reproductive health was an important question for them in their vote
Right.
choice, and then we get the Dobbs decision, and suddenly it's, when you
Top
when
of the
you
list.
when you look at crosstabs by gender, it starts to get into like number three, and
Mhm.
like that is that it feels like a thing that is like there's a shock and a like, well, I was taking for granted that Roe would never be overturned, and I also wasn't
Mhm.
really thinking about abortion including people with ectopic pregnancies or with other kind of healthcare crises in the midst of pregnancy. I was just thinking about those loose girls in high school or whatever, like that kind of whatever their stereotype of what people who get abortions look like, that was what their that was what their stereotype was. And then they were like,
Right.
oh, you mean that would have included me, like
Right.
um, and that sort of shock and it
Mhm.
kind of coming home emotionally about what it means
Yep.
suddenly changes the response to that question. I
Yeah.
think we saw some of that in the summer of 2020 as well, with people getting to some kind of peak that, may or may not have been sustained around police violence against unarmed people of color. And like suddenly, what are we going to do about the cops became like an issue for even white Democrats who might not have thought about it previously.
Yeah.
Like there's some of it that maybe there are hints there in those kind of moments of public wake up to a
Yeah.
particular issue where the emotional response drives a policy preference and then that drives a party or candidate preference. I don't know.
I'm thinking about, like, sociology and psych research on threat
Hmm.
that might be, like, instrumental in this conversation. So maybe it's not that emotions are doing the work. I mean, emotions clearly have a job to do here,
Right.
but um, thinking about, like, real versus imagined threats, like
Hmm.
heightened threat sensitivity
Yep.
towards particular issues might also heighten, like, fear and anxiety, and then move those issues, like, to the top of your list, whereas before they weren't. So there's
Hmm.
some event, like a Supreme Court ruling, um, or a police shooting or something,
Yeah.
that might change how you would prioritize that. But, like, in my mind when you asked that question didn't immediately go to, like, threat, like, because you asked about it in the context of emotions, but, like, I think that's what it would actually fit into
Mm-hmm.
in that literature. And then like from that threat, like the stimulus is the threat or whatever's
Right.
happening. Like I would also imagine that suburban white women who are, based on the data that we have access to, the ones most likely to use IVF,
Mm-hmm.
who would have been otherwise sitting this conversation about reproductive health out, but for certain states deciding or starting to at least discuss legislation um, that would also bar access from like IVF, like which
Mm-hmm.
is I know a number of women that were like I don't support abortions, like I'm pro life all the way, but IVF, like
Right.
I want to have, what if I want to have my baby, there's, what if I want to have my baby, I've already frozen my eggs, like,
Mm-hmm.
and so this wasn't an issue for those women, but now it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I would think that like my mind after like talking through this immediately goes to like the threat literature, um and like the realistic group conflict threat literature is like huge, but like the real versus imagined threat, and then like how that might change, how that might activate some kind of emotion, and then that's what actually ends up changing the behavior.
Oh, we should talk about a whole theory I
That's
have that is
good, girl. That's it.
I have
We got a paper, we got a book. Because it's not like it's just we got a paper, we have papers. You might want to cut this
Mhm.
out of the podcast for the academics that are watching, because we focused on this for years. But I mean, that's what it ultimately is. And like
Mhm.
every election, different issues are, obviously, I won't say like prioritized, but different issues are magnified,
Mhm.
for the parties. Um, so, for example, in 2018, the issue that's magnified is the Me Too movement in
Right.
particular, right? Like, just as an example. And so, what happens in 2018? You get some of like the highest rates of turnout that we've seen among women across
Right.
racial and ethnic groups in decades. For turnout of people running for state and local office, for women running for Congress, even. Um, and, a lot of that you could talk about in terms of like obviously a reaction to Me Too, but when you're thinking about it, it's like the threat response. It's
Yeah.
legitimately, and the emotions that accompany that response that might lead to people engaging in politics, right? So anger,
Yeah.
mobilizing emotion. You're angry about what's been happening with women, what might have happened, to you in terms of sexual assault, sexual violence as a woman.
Yeah.
And you decide that you want to champion those issues. You decide to run for politics, right?
Mhm.
Or you decide to support candidates that, you know, also support the Me Too movement, or, women's rights in different ways. So I feel like that might be the little step
You've
that's
also
been
just made
missing.
me think about, huh?
Like that might be the step that's been missing. Like
Yeah.
it's about like it's the event, but it's like the threat. Like it's not just the emotion. It's about what actually could happen, perceived like real threat, versus like perceived and imagined threat. And then how you're reacting to that emotionally, and then in turn the behavior that occurs.
In framing it that way, you've also made me think about I was talking to these folks from Valens Games, and Amal Ali, who's the SVP of strategy there, was talking about fear-based marketing as being a challenge. Um, I'll put it mildly in this way. And coming out of the advertising industry as I do, you know, there's always kind of a conversation about like, do we want to, um, like a lot of marketing that is aimed at moms is fundamentally fear-based marketing. It is, aren't you afraid you're going to break the baby? If you're afraid you're going to break the baby, then you should buy Pampers, whatever. And so there's a lot that kind of capitalizes on that, even if it's like showing you warm and fuzzy scenarios. There is still this playing on your fear of being a bad parent that is happening there. And so the way you ward off being a bad parent is buy the right products, right? Or you're afraid of being unattractive, and so buy these products, and then you won't be unattractive. But on the other side of it, there are messages that are meant to be aspirational, hopeful, you imagining your better self and trying to buy products and services that you think will help you achieve your better self. And it's not so much leaning on the reject your not better self. It is on the point yourself in the direction of whatever, just do it to some degree, is this idea of if you have a body, you're an athlete, we've already affirmed you, now get out there and go for a jog or whatever. But I wonder about that in political messaging. But the way you framed it that's interesting to me is, in the sort of the white people discourse around race in candidates like Kamala Harris or Barack Obama or who have you, there is this like, is it going to spark feelings of racial resentment? I saw some commentary about like, do white women need to do the work to be okay with a Black woman skipping over them in the
Mm,
chain of who gets to be president?
mm,
On the other hand, it did seem like there was some writing about white people who voted for Obama doing so in part because they don't like thinking of themselves as racist. And so to ward that off, they will be sure to vote for the candidate that proves they're not, right? Like the worst thing you can do as a white person is be accused of being a racist. And so I'll prove I'm not. Oops, I just hit the
mm,
microphone. I prove I'm not by voting for the Black candidate. And
mm,
I wonder about like, that's more also a threat of like, I don't want to be accused of being
mm,
racist.
mhm, mhm.
But I also wonder about the flip side of it, which is just like, oh, wait, that way's the future. Like, and the need for catharsis after a lot of threat, like the need to feel like we're moving away from threat, even if only temporarily. I don't know if I'm being clear about that. I was thinking about
Yeah,
this
I
in.
mean, you know, thinking about the political environment that we're in right now, um, some of the comments that I've been, reading online and seeing in different outlets is like, is America as a whole, right? Like in the position right now um, to overwhelmingly support a woman of color for president? We'll find out in November. But like when
Mm-hmm.
you think about the racial dynamics, the racial and gendered dynamics
Mm-hmm.
happening in politics right now, it could go either way.
Right.
There could be, um, white folks that will turn out for whoever's at the top of the ticket, like we just talked about,
Mm-hmm.
like whoever is atop the Democratic ticket, um, even if it is a woman of color. Um,
Well, and some of the
and there could
polling
be
looks
folks,
like that there's like a stable
yeah,
43% who are going to vote for
yeah,
whoever the
yeah,
Democrat
yeah.
is. Yeah.
I mean, some of the polling that I've seen coming out today, and some of the stuff I know that'll probably be released tomorrow. Some of the indicators that I've seen is like, oh, actually, there's like a lot of white Americans that would get behind this candidate, would get
Mm-hmm.
behind, Kamala. Um, but there's a number of white folks that would also not support her
Yeah.
because she's, a woman of color, and a number of people of color that also, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people just in general
Right.
that won't, regardless of, like race and ethnicity, that won't support her. Maybe because she's a woman,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe because they just don't believe she's the best candidate, to do the job. It would be multiple reasons,
Mm-hmm.
on both sides, um, that could be specifically about race or gender, or could be policy focused, or not. Like
Mm-hmm.
we'll just have to see.
In most of the interviews I have done up to this point, one of the things that pollsters have said to me, journalists have said to me, is that there is this role to play for the public in being more, I don't know, uh, being like responsible consumers of public polling. And part of me feels like, is it the layperson's job to be sophisticated about margins of error and sample frames and that sort of thing? Or are we talking about something else? And I'm curious from your perspective, do you think that's the burden of the reader? Do you think that's the burden of the news outlet reporting on polls? Is that what we mean when we say being a better consumer of public polling? What
Hmm.
how where do you come down on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that consumers need to be better consumers of polls, and journalists need to be better reporters of polls.
Mhm.
So pollsters are always going to give you the top lines, whatever they have available on the data that they want to, publicly share. It's just how are those things being interpreted,
Mhm.
um, by the masses, as well as like by journalists. So like, what are they actually doing? So I think there's a few things that the public should know, and any journalists. Hopefully, the ones that do the reporting on polls are the ones that are familiar,
Mhm.
with polling practices. Like this is kind of what they
I
do.
think
That
there
means
has
like,
been
oh,
some improvement on that score over the last
yeah,
several years. More
yeah.
actual
I feel
pollsters
like
involved.
right. I agree with that, but I think generally things that people should know about polls, is that there's wide variation in polls, um, not a great deal of standardization. And so I
Mhm.
think that's something that folks that write about it and consumers should be aware of. So variation, in what? So things like, the length of the survey, the amount or the number of questions, the amount of time it takes to complete the survey, the mode of the survey. Are we doing like face to face surveys? Are we using
Mhm.
landline, cell phones, robocalling? Is it online polls? Variation in the time that the survey might be in the field, 1 to 7 days. What was happening during those 1 to 7 days or longer that it was in the field? And so I think that for anybody consuming and those interpreting those results, especially like from the journalist end, but also from the broader population, and we need to take um, this wide variation like into consideration as we're reading headlines.
Mhm.
Um, and usually there's always something that says like click the link to learn more, right, about this poll. And so I think the advice I would give to people is like click the link, actually read. I think for folks that are writing about polls and surveys, when you have a headline that says 58% of Americans believe, insert whatever they believe,
Mhm.
you click on the click here for more information. And it's like, we surveyed 150 people. And you're like, huh?
Mhm.
Or we surveyed 350 people. And so I think, a more honest headline would be something, it's not sexy, but it's like 54% of Americans polled in this survey believe
Mhm.
X, right? But that's not like sexy. That's not catchy. That's not going to get people to click,
Right.
on what you've written. So doing even a bit more signposting, if you're not going to put it in the title, a bit more signposting in the article. We conducted this survey on these days. This is the amount of people that are in the survey. Give the reader some indication on perhaps who was included in the survey. So like, does it lean Republican or does it lean, Democrat? This is something that happened, in 2012 in particular, that a couple of networks ended up having to apologize for, because quite a bit of the polling data in 12, was talking about how Obama like wasn't going to win.
Mhm.
And so that was one of the thoughts going into the 2012 election. And I think like maybe CNN and Fox, I would have to go back and look at it just to be sure, but a few major networks issued like apologies after that election, because they had been like oversampling Republicans. And so, no duh, you oversample members of the opposite party. Like, this is going to give you,
Mhm.
results that are skewed.
Mhm.
And so, even if folks that are writing about, the survey or its results could do just a bit more, like a sentence or two that explains like who's in the sample, right?
Mhm.
Like, the sample had 1,500 individuals, even though the United States has over 300 million, right? But the sample has 1,500 individuals, with these particular demographic indicators, so that the person reading understands that it's not really all of America that feels this way. It's just the folks that you had included, in your poll in particular.
Mhm.
So there's that. And then, of course, all the things related to, variation that I mentioned as well. So I think that, a lot of folks are probably not going to go in and click that link. So if you can just write one sentence that
Right.
gives the reader an understanding of like who was included in this survey.
Right.
And how many people? I mean, most of the write-ups do have like the sample size somewhere written in the article, but it could just be like a really maybe small print underneath the title even
Mm-hmm.
that has some of these, demographic factors, sample sizes, the number of individuals from each group that was included. It's like 1,500 people and 40 of them were Black, right?
Right.
Or
Right.
like, so at least like having that knowledge, you would understand that maybe this is not a position that the overwhelming majority of individuals like in my group or groups that I identify might have. Or maybe if it was landlines and not cell phones, right? Then maybe that's also going to change your understanding of like who was included,
Mm-hmm.
in the sample as well, and how likely you are to believe that there's a critical mass of people that have those same opinions.
Yeah. I think that's a good place for us to end. And also it's kind of the way this whole show got started was maybe we'd all freak out a little less about the polls if we knew a little bit more about how they worked and thought of them as interesting data, but not predictions for the future and not things to get too worked up about on any given poll. You start seeing a whole
Absolutely.
bunch of polls going in a direction that scares the hell out of you. That's a different story, but um, but that's really really good advice. So
Yeah.
I've already taken more time than I bargained for, Camille, but it was really nice to talk to
We
you.
can talk all day.
Yes,
You
exactly.
know it. We can do research together all
Oh,
year long.
oh my God, I would love to. Not gonna lie, I would love to. Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farah Bostic, with Paul Soldera. Production by The Difference Engine and edited by me. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter and find out immediately when new episodes drop. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, drop us a note if you have any questions about poll design or sampling or weighting or anything else, and we'll see you next time.